Hello and welcome to DawnNews English. Thank you so much for taking out time for us. We'll start with Pakistan. In recent months, there has been growing concerns regarding the use of military courts to try civilians in Pakistan. This has raised serious questions regarding the fairness and transparency of the judicial process in the country. How does Amnesty International view the trial of civilians in military courts, and what steps do you believe the Pakistani government should take to ensure a fair and just legal process for all its citizens?
Thank you very much. So, as you know, we are an international human rights organization, and we take the lead from international legal standards, particularly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Civil and Political Rights Convention. And these are very clear on the question of military court. It's a no-no. Civilians should not be tried by military court. Sadly, it has happened throughout Pakistan history. Even though it is now coming back with force, it is not a novelty in Pakistan history taking place in Pakistan. Most recently, which has raised much alarm with us, the government has announced that it will try some of the 9th of May, a year ago, the 9th of May protesters in and by military court. Trying civilians in military court is in absolute violation of international law. Trying civilians who were exercising their legitimate right to protest peacefully and to freedom of expression is also an additional violation to international law. We see the use of military court as an intimidation, as a way of cracking down on dissent, as a way of imposing the militarization of civic space, the militarization of the judicial process and justice. And that is quite unacceptable. Pakistan is the only country in South Asia in recent history to allow for military court to play such a role vis-à-vis civilians. Historically, those trials have been held secretly. They are lacking in transparency. There is no due process safeguard. They are not independent as we would expect the court to be. So they violate international law, and in particular Article 14 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Pakistan has ratified and which guarantees the right to trial before a competent, independent, impartial tribunal established by law. It is not just international law that guarantees the right to a fair trial. As a matter of fact, the Pakistan Constitution guarantees the right to a fair trial.
Right. So freedom of expression has also come under significant threat in Pakistan, with various forms of media censorship, including the recent ban on Twitter and, in fact, most recently, the bid to strengthen the defamation laws. Now, this has led to widespread criticism from human rights organizations worldwide. What is the Amnesty International stance on the suppression of freedom of expression and press, particularly the Twitter ban?
Amnesty International is quite alarmed by the deterioration of freedom of expression and the shrinking space for the media and civil society to exercise its fundamental rights in Pakistan. We are particularly alarmed by the blocking of X, formerly Twitter, after the election. It's in violation of international law. It is a violation of the space for legitimate expression. So this blanket ban of X, formerly Twitter, is a major violation of the space, a digital space for expression, in particular for the right to peacefully dissent. But as we know, Twitter is being used by people for many, many reasons. We are also witnessing a blanket ban on opposition leaders' speeches. We have seen a brief suspension of leading media platforms. I want to mention here the 3 journalists on behalf of whom we have worked: Asad Ali Tour, Ali Wazir, Hamid Mir. The space for free speech in Pakistan is shrinking. what should happen? Well, the most important thing that Pakistan must do is uphold its international obligation under the ICCPR, under the UDHR. It must amend restrictive law, including, for instance, FEMRA ordinance, which is very poor and use very vague terms such as disinformation. We need to ensure that the legal safeguards for free speech are indeed implemented, that the laws are not being weaponized for punitive actions against people who happen to be disliked by those in power. It is very clear that the criticism of state institutions does not constitute a crime under international law and international freedom of expression. The right to protest is also a fundamental human rights, peaceful protest, and that must be protected. So basically, Pakistan must do the opposite of what it's doing right now.
Okay. We were talking about freedom of expression. Moving on to our neighbors. In January, Amnesty International released a statement saying that in India, many national and international human rights associations, including the Amnesty International India, have suffered judicial harassment, intimidation, arbitrary closure. Many human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, political opponents, peaceful demonstrators, and students have been subjected to arbitrary arrests and detentions and unfounded prosecutions, illegal digital surveillance, and other violations. Now, the International Human Rights Organization, including the Amnesty, has been particularly critical of Narendra Modi's government and his recent election campaign. And yet we see, repercussions for Indian government or Modi are non-existent. In fact, we've also seen that the Western countries are treading very carefully on the issue of Indian operatives on foreign soil, such as Canada and the US. Why do you think that is?
We agree with your assessment of the situation of freedom of expression in India. Prime Minister Modi has presided over a rapid deterioration of freedom of expression in India, very sadly similarly to what I've just described in Pakistan. We have documented increasing violence against religious minorities. We have done an extensive report on punitive demolition of Muslim properties in India. We also ourselves and others been on the receiving end of repression since Amnesty International is not allowed to operate out of India, but we're not the only one. Oxfam, Greenpeace, and others are also on the receiving end of the crackdown on against NGOs. We have also documented the criminalization of dissent using anti-terror law, such as we have plenty of cases in that regard. So these are really challenging times for human rights in India and for freedom of expression, again along the lines of what's happening in Pakistan. As to where the international community act on that or doesn't act, you are putting your fingers on an issue that Amnesty International has been denouncing for many years, but we are denouncing it even more strongly right now, which is the use of double standards by the international community, particularly by Western powers, but not only. China and Russia are very good with double standard as well. And we are also denouncing the clear deterioration of the international rule of law system. Western government on that one also taking a lead. So the double standards are reflected in how countries such as the UK, the United States, responding to the deterioration in India. They are plainly demonstrated in the way Western governments are responding to the incredible catastrophic situation in Gaza. It is part and parcel of the way the international system right now is governed, i.e. not governed.
Yeah. So the impunity that leaders such as Modi enjoy, it's like you said, it's also adding to the growing perception of double standard. Now, comparing the treatment of Israel's actions in Gaza and to Russia's actions in Ukraine, both involve invasions. Yet the international responses, particularly from the West, have been markedly different. So my question to you is, do you believe that the democratically elected leaders are acting with impunity resembling dictatorships and escaping accountability accountability for international human rights violations in their countries?
Of course. I mean, it's not because you are democratically elected leaders that you are not violating your international human rights obligations. Amnesty International is documenting, sadly, with great frequency, how violations are taking place throughout Europe, how violations are taking place in the United States, whether they are around freedom of expression, whether they are around the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, whether they concern economic and social rights. No countries right now is immune to criticism over their own treatment of and their own implementation of their obligations. If you are talking about their international stand on rule of law and their double standard, that too is a sad characteristic of the international system. We have actually suggested that there is a complete breakdown of international law at the moment. That breakdown is both the product of what Russia did in Ukraine and what the United States is doing with Israel on Gaza. So the two superpowers are both responsible for breaking the normative order and international rule of law. Let's focus on Gaza for 1 minute. Israel, following what happened on October 7, which saw more than 1,000 Israeli killed and some 300 people abducted, that amounted to war crimes, possible crime against humanity. In response, Israel has suggested that their military objective was to eliminate Hamas. But that military objective quickly transformed into a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. That is a war crime. That collective punishment has been characterized by countless indiscriminate and targeted shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructures. It has been characterized by the blocking of international aid. People could not access food, still cannot access food, water, medicine, and so on. The campaign on Gaza by Israel has been characterized by the highest number of journalists ever killed. It has been characterized by the highest number of humanitarian workers ever killed, and it has been characterized by something like 35,000 Palestinians dead over a 7-month campaign. That too is one of the highest number of civilian victims ever registered since the end of the war. The United States, in response to the plenty of evidence of violation of international law, has chosen to turn away from these evidence and continuing to provide support to Israel, including military support, but also support at the United Nations. So in so doing, the United States is participating, contributing to the breakdown of international law, particularly international humanitarian law, the law that should govern how conflicts are run. It is weakening international institutions by using its right of veto. It is making it quasi-impossible for any kind of commitment or ruling, rather, by the International Court of Justice to deliver something meaningful. So, the situation right now internationally, I have to tell you from the standpoint of Amnesty International, is a catastrophe. We are on the edge, if not having already fallen into an abyss. It started with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was a violation of the UN Charter. It is continuing now with the United States violating its own obligation under international law, possibly even its obligation under the Genocide Convention. So we are in an extremely, extremely dramatic situation. We are grateful to countries like Pakistan, to countries like South Africa, for holding the line on international law. We are grateful to South Africa for going to court, to the International Court of Justice, and reminding the world that there is something called international law that must be upheld. We are grateful to all the countries, including Pakistan, that have voted for a ceasefire repeatedly and against the United States. We want to call on those countries, including Pakistan, to keep holding the line, including domestically. So while Pakistan is doing very well on the question of international law and Gaza and the role of the United Nations, Pakistan is not doing so well with its international obligation vis-à-vis Afghan refugees. And that is a problem. That too is double standard. So everyone is engaged in double standard and everyone is breaking down international law. And who will be the victims? Civilians, people, mothers, fathers, children. They will all be the victim of this breakdown of international law.
I have two questions regarding what you just said. So we were talking about Gaza and the breakdown of international law. Could you just tell me what the current situation, the current global situation, what implication does this have for the future of international human rights law and the credibility of global human rights organization and advocacy?
On the first part of your question, the implication for international law, I think we are at a critical juncture. We have countries like Russia and the United States trying to pretend that international law no longer applies or certainly don't apply to them or to their allies. International law does not apply to Russia invading Ukraine, an act of aggression and colonialism, by the way, and it does not apply to the United States, including its responsibility under the Genocide Convention. So those countries are pretending that international law can be eliminated. There is nothing to replace it. There is nothing at the moment to replace it. So any move to undermine further the international rule of law system is a catastrophe for all of us. Not just for the people of Gaza, even though they are on the front line, not just for the people of Ukraine, even though they are on the front line. Because the moment countries as powerful as Russia and the United States are saying international law does not apply to me, the moment they are also justifying those violations, not just trying to violate it, but justifying that violation, you will have endless numbers of countries that will follow suit. That will be a disaster. It's coming on top of the climate crisis, which we are not very well equipped to deal with. It's coming on top of artificial intelligence, which we don't know how to regulate. So right now, the abyss is right there. And it is every country's responsibilities to remember that when we fall in the abyss, going out of it is extremely painful and that many innocent people will die. So that's for your question. Our legitimacy has never been higher. Our legitimacy has never been higher because we are holding the line. We are working with many governments, in fact, who are trying to push and to remind the powerful state that there is still something called the rule of law and international normative framework. We are holding the line on the protection of civilians. It is not that we are suggesting that nothing must change. Of course, international law must be adapted to the world we live in. This is why we are supporting Vanuatu, another global South country, going to the ICJ and demanding demanding an interpretation of international human rights law vis-à-vis climate justice. Fantastic initiative. We are supporting any move right now to ensure that artificial intelligence is well regulated, that the very large tech companies that are ruling the world of economy, that too are regulated. So we are not so naive to think that international law should not be, transformed somehow. But that transformation must be well thought out, and it cannot be done on the back of civilians. It cannot be done on the back of Ukrainians and on the back of Palestinians. And this is what right now the United States, Israel, and Russia are prepared to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Agnès, for giving us time.